Meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the 50th meeting of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development of the House of Commons. Before we begin, I would like to remind all members and other meeting participants in the room of the following important preventive measures to prevent disruptive and potentially harmful audio feedback incidents that can cause injuries. All in-person participants are reminded to keep their earpieces away from all microphones at all times. As indicated in the communiqué from the Speaker to all members on Monday, April 29th, the following measures have been taken to help prevent audio feedback incidents. All earpieces have been replaced by a model which greatly reduces the probability of audio feedback. The new earpieces are black in color, whereas the former earpieces were gray. Please use only a black approved earpiece. By default, all unused earpieces will be unplugged at the start of a meeting. When you are not using your earpiece, please place it face down on the middle of the sticker, which is on the table for this purpose. As indicated, please consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. The room layout has been adjusted to increase the distance between microphones and reduce the chance of feedback from an ambient earpiece. These measures are in place so that we can conduct our business without interruption and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. To make sure the meeting runs smoothly, I would point out this is in hybrid mode. And I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of members and witnesses. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For members in the room, please raise your hand if you wish to speak. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. You are free to use the official language of your choice. Interpreting services are available. You have a choice between listening to the floor, the English, or the French. If interpreting is interrupted, please notify me immediately. And I would remind you that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I'm informing the subcommittee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. Draft Georgian bill on foreign agents. Before I begin,
your attention that one in our last study, we had agreed that we will do three studies, one in Georgia, one in Iran, one in Ethiopia. And I would like to emphasize on the fact if the time allow us to do a study for Sudan, but the situation in Sudan is going terribly in the bad direction. Maintenant, avant projet de loi.
The Georgian draft bill on foreign agents, pursuant to Standing Order 108-2, and the motion passed by the subcommittee on Tuesday, April 30th, 2024, the subcommittee will commence its study of Georgia's draft bill on foreign agents. I would like to welcome our witnesses. First, Center for Development and Democracy, Ketevan Achachava, Executive Director, by video conference for a maximum of 5 minutes. You will have no more than 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will move to questions. Welcome, Ms. Chachava. I would now invite you to make your opening statement, which should last no longer than 5 minutes. You are welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you. Honorable members of the House of Commons, I am deeply grateful for this opportunity to speak before you today. It is an honor, privilege, and great responsibility. My name is Ketevan Achachava. I am a civic and democracy activist from Georgia, with 18 years of experience in non-profit sector. I'm executive director and the founder of Tbilisi-based NGO, Center for Development and Democracy, as well as steering committee member of the World Movement for Democracy and a non-resident fellow with SEPA. I stand before you as a proud Georgian citizen, committed to democratic, Euro-Atlantic future of my country, and as a representative of tens of thousands of Georgians, from the younger to older, from so-called silent generation to Gen Alpha, who have taken the streets in peaceful protest for past month. I address you today with a deep concern regarding the recent developments in Georgia, specifically their introduction of a Russian-style draft law on transparency of foreign influence, also referred to as a foreign agent law. Our struggle is not about opposing a single piece of legislation. It's about defending the very fundamentals of our democracy, freedom, rule of law, and our chosen path of Euro-Atlantic inspiration, protected by the Georgian Constitution. The state objective of the proposed legislation is to ensure transparency concerning foreign influence and funding by implementing a specialized database. While transparency is universally valued, this legislation mandates that NGOs and independent media receiving over 20% of their funding from abroad must register as organizations carrying out the interests of a foreign power. Such a catalyzation of our stigmatization of the organizations, that is one of the biggest issues that we all face. It doesn't only diminishes the dignity and respect, but also not only for the organizations, but also for the individuals associated with the organizations. This legislation mirrors oppression measures seen in Russia, Belarus, and Kyrgyzstan, where similar laws have silenced dissent, violated international human rights standards, and led to closure or forced exile. Such laws serve only to weaken democracy, as evident by VDEM report. Georgia, as an EU candidate and NATO aspirant country, finds itself at a crossroad where upholding democratic principle is crucial. Opening different polls constantly indicate that 75 to 80% of Georgians support European and Euro-Atlantic integration. However, proposed law conducts these principles, posing significant threat to silencing the vibrant civil society and free media. These pillars are vital and integral to our aspiration for EU and NATO membership. This progression of the events has been alarmingly fast. Announced only on April 3rd, law has already passed with 2 hearings, and the stakes could not be higher as we anticipate the final readings of this law by the end of June. As we continue to protest under the banner, Yes to Europe, No to Russian law, our peaceful demonstrations are met with disproportionate force and targeted violence against opposition leaders and civic activists, further worsening the crisis and existing polarization, which is becoming deeply alarming. Therefore, I can call you to stand with us in this critical moment on the right side of history. We seek your assistance against attack on civil society and media freedom, which are signs of democracy's backsliding. Your reaffirmation of support for Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspiration is crucial. Let us send a clear message to the members of the government and the Parliament of Georgia that attack on civil society and media freedom are unacceptable and damaging our democratic progress. This is not the path towards advancing closer to Euro-Atlantic family that Georgia is striving to join. Thank you for strong support of Georgia's NATO membership. Your dedication to human rights and democracy worldwide is deeply appreciated. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to hearing your insights and addressing any questions you may have.
Thank you, Madam Shashava. Well done, 5 minutes perfectly. Now I would like to invite Madame Natasha Landsteidet, Professor, Department du Gouvernement, par vidéoconférence. Welcome.
Thank you. I want to thank the subcommittee and honorable members for inviting me to this session. My name is Natasha Lindstedt, and I'm a professor of government at the University of Essex, and I'm an expert on authoritarian regimes and autocratization. For the last several years, I've been involved in a research project which included traveling to Georgia in September of 2022 and interviewing 24 interviewees, including academics, individuals who worked at NGOs, opposition politicians, and journalists. Foreign funding is the lifeline of NGOs in Georgia, and the new draft law, which designates NGOs that receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad as operatives of foreign government, would effectively undercut NGOs in Georgia. This attack on NGOs represents a clear assault on democracy, as NGOs give a voice to those who are unrepresented and powerless and are vital to fostering civil society. NGOs also support political participation, the free flow of accurate information, and media literacy. Autocrats consider weakening NGOs a critical step to preventing threats to their power, and many autocratizing countries have possibly been inspired by Russia's very tough foreign agent laws, including Hungary, Kyrgyzstan, Cambodia, Egypt, Ethiopia, China, and Uganda. Russia first started placing restrictions on NGOs in 2005, but implemented much more rigorous laws in 2012 following fraudulent elections that led to massive protests. And then again, more stringent laws in 2014, and then again in 2020. Under this expanded legislation, authorities in Russia have the power to label individuals, not just organizations, engaged in political activity as a foreign agent. This leaves them very vulnerable to jail terms of up to 5 years should they fail to report their activities precisely in line with the law's requirements. Though Georgia's law is not as stringent as the laws in Russia, this is the trajectory. These laws are incredibly arbitrary, and as mentioned, the goal is to make it near impossible for NGOs to operate, particularly those that are supporting democratic norms. By making the law arbitrary, it makes it difficult to determine what is permitted, forcing NGOs to err on the side of caution and to focus solely on their own survival rather than any activity that are actually supportive of democracy. According to some experts that I interviewed in Georgia, Georgia is not democratic because it is more of a competitive authoritarian regime. And the Georgia Dream Party is not committed to democracy and is under the considerable influence from Russia. Opposition politicians, NGOs, academics, they claim that they were already being surveilled by the Georgian government, and this is inspired by the Soviet Russian-style tactic of kompromat, to find compromising information on them, which would then be used against them. Russia does not accept the boundaries of the post-Soviet world, and Georgians remain very concerned about facing another invasion, or that their de facto leader, Bidzina Ivanishvili, is either dependent on the Russians or has coinciding interests. And Russia, through its vast propaganda machine, claims that the greatest existential threat facing countries in the post-Soviet sphere are Western values, embodied by, for example, non-traditional forms of marriage. NGOs work to counter these disinformation campaigns. Closing civic spaces and infringing upon the work of NGOs is a global trend. It's a frightening one, and more people are facing serious restrictions. Though authoritarian regimes often do not ban NGOs outright, they want to keep a close eye on them, and they mimic democracies in many different ways, one of which is to create these fake NGOs known as gongos that are merely an extension of the state, something which Georgia has done as well. And the Georgian government has embarked on other tactics to weaken NGOs, whether that be engaging in personal attacks on people who work in NGOs, starting to show the salaries of people that work in the NGO sector, publicly shaming people that work in NGOs, or claiming that protests are organized by NGOs to destabilize the country, claiming that people that work for NGOs don't care about democracy or the Georgian people, expelling people working at NGOs, or supporting far-right groups that might directly attack NGOs. The spate of attacks on NGOs is a critical tool used by authoritarian regimes to expand their power, and though these laws are passed in defense of sovereignty, they represent a clear break from democracy. As Russian influence continues to grow in the region and around the world, these types of copycat laws are more likely to become the norm. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lindy stated. And now, je vais maintenant ouvrir le débat.
And now we'll open it up to questions, beginning with Mr. Majboud. You have 7 minutes. Thank you.
Madam Shashava, thank you very much for your commentary. May I ask, what do you believe the implications will be for your current status and registration?
Thank you for your question. Excuse me. I'm sorry. So basically, as I've mentioned, the law itself is brought by the name of the transparency, and if the transparency would be the true idea of the law, there's all the different options available with existing legislation, with the minor changes to ensure extra transparency with, for example, grants. Unfortunately, what happens with this legislation is that it is bringing the stigma that will basically make sure that no NGO in this country will register under the name that I have that it's opposing on us, which is organization carrying out the interest of foreign power. Because we do not represent foreign power, so therefore what it means that if this legislation will pass, and potentially by the end of June, there is 60 days before this goes into the force, and that means that we have to all register by ourselves, or Ministry of Justice has the power to register everybody who has been receiving grants in 2023, which is more than 20% of their income, which would mean that being in this registry literally brings a stigma, it makes it almost impossible for people to work under this name. Because again, going back to history of Georgia, foreign agents are not really the term that anybody as a civic activist, for example, would ever agree upon. So logistically or officially, there is no official interference with registration until the first month when we are not registered, which would be potentially September, just 1 month before the elections in Georgia. That would mean the 25,000 lari fine, which is around I want to say 12,000 Canadian dollars. And then every other month, it's a 20,000 lari addition, which would directly mean that we will not be able to function if we do not register, and if we are not ready to take the stigma, it would mean that basically there would be no NGOs left in this country, and there would be no free media who is getting support from our Western partners, including US, including Canada, including EU, and so on.
Thank you, Madam Shashava. May I ask a follow-up? I understand that there's been a delegation going through Washington from Georgia Dream who claims that this legislation is designed to stave off extremist and Russian interference. In your opinion, what is the true intent of the law?
As I've mentioned, if the transparency would be the main idea, as Georgian Dream tries to raise, then nobody in this sector is actually against transparency. We are already very transparent. Every NGO on our official website, we are publishing every grant that we are receiving from our Western partners. So to be honest, this is not really the area where if there is any fraud money or potential questions, that this is the area that needs to be investigated. There is really none. So unfortunately, what we can already see for past year, since the last March, when there was this law actually was introduced firstly, there was a huge protest, and the Georgian Dream actually withdrew its support to this law. And that from then, very intensive anti-Western, anti-NGO propaganda and disinformation and misinformation campaign has been carried. Even today, to be honest, it's already a huge danger because, for example, today my colleague was already beaten in the streets together with the media representatives. There's already quite a high tension and polarization, adding that the NGOs are agents, that NGOs are here to, destabilize, to have a revolution, have a colorful revolution, that everybody who has studied abroad is a potential agent. So all this ongoing disinformation and misinformation is already harming the sector so much that we can already see what is potential threat here. So as I have mentioned, bringing this Russian-style laws, this is not EU Western-style transparency approach law, right? This law has a number of issues in it, which includes one, fining, destabilizing, literally closing down the NGOs, the media organizations, as well as potentially, bringing us to exile. And as we have seen similar legislation in Russia, in Belarus, or in Kyrgyzstan, this is not it is not a positive potential developments. So if the true side of this is a backsliding of democracy, it's going to be a true side, the true outcome of this legislation is a silencing the independent voices that are so vital in democratic societies. And that's how, the very vibrant and strong civil society of Georgia that we have been so proud of, might just disappear. So this is actually quite a dangerous zone that Georgian Dream is entering.
Do I have time, Mr. Chair, for one more question? One final question then to Professor Lindstedt. How can the Georgian government refer to this law as European when all allies have condemned it as being completely incompatible with European values?
I think that's just something that in particular regimes that are autocratizing, try to spin things in different ways, to spin it as it's European, or they could spin it that it's about their sovereignty, to really mask the real identity of, or the real reason behind this law. And I think that has already been mentioned. This is to deal with any kind of potential threat to the ruling party, because NGOs to an autocratizing country is that one big threat. They're vibrant, particularly in a country like Georgia. They are supportive of democracy, vital to supporting democracy, and they threaten the incumbent Georgia Dream Party and that government there. So they'll try to spin it in a different way, and that's something that many, like I mentioned, many autocratizing countries, they say something, but they're really doing something else. We've seen in Hungary this type of spin as well being used to justify these types of infringements on NGOs, but it's really a pretext to prevent any threats to their power.
Thank you, Ms. Lindstedt. Thank you, Mr. Majmender. And now I give the parole to Madame Vandenbelt for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And my first question is for Ketivan Chicheva. And I just want to start by saying that I think all of us have admiration and support and stand in solidarity with you and with all of those like you. And I've seen the images of the thousands of Georgians in the street fighting for your freedom, your democracy, for freedom of the press, for civil society. And I'm very glad that one of the things that you said is that this isn't about one individual law. This is about making sure that there is going to be space for democracy and civil society and media freedom in Georgia. So the first question that I have for you is, can you tell us, first of all, the impact that this will have widely on Georgian civil society and on Georgian independent media. And also, if you could update us a little bit about what is happening in the streets right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We truly feel and appreciate the solidarity and support. And once again, thank you so much for having us today and discussing these very stressful developments in Georgia, in Canada. And thank you once again for all the support we have seen for past decades since the independence of our country. Impact of this law on civil society, it's going to be crucial. There's over 30,000 registered NGOs in this country with various fields of work, from watchdog organizations working on election observation, working on awareness raising of the voters, to fighting for human rights, for women's rights. The number of cases that Georgian NGOs have won in different international courts defending the citizens of this country. Additionally, there's a lot of regional organizations or different types of organizations who will be under this law literally closing down because, for example, those who work on the smaller scale on their local issues, addressing and fighting for children's rights or animals' rights, or providing free food or providing services for people with disabilities or IDPs. So the numbers are limitless because literally this law is not having any distinction, or there's no difference based on the field of work or based on sometimes that there is actually a mix-up of this law with the potential work of the lobbyists. So again, if there is a mixture or there is a misunderstanding, there is a law in Georgia about lobbying. So why don't there is additional, if there is a need for additional clarifications, that could be addressed. So once again, this law has nothing to do with the transparency. This law is directly attacking and directly abolishing basically civil society and destroying civil society, because once again, there's no way that NGO in this country will register and we will take the name of foreign agent when we are not, and we have never been. And additionally, with all the fines that are going to come based on every month, imagine there's literally no chance of NGOs dealing with such a high financial fees. Concerning the updates on the protests, it's actually now, it's already 1 a.m. in Georgia, but there's people and there's young people outside in the streets. And since the reintroduction of this law from April 3rd, the street protests have not stopped. There has been thousands and even over 100,000 citizens in the streets protesting this law. And the most important aspect, I think, in this protest is that it's a very clear message: no to Russian law, yes to Europe. Because our European and Euro-Atlantic integration is a main priority for Georgians. It's a main priority for our country's future, and that has been also strengthened by our constitution. So therefore, yes, that has been a lot of motivation. It has been a lot of inspiration to see actually a younger generation, even my children who are 12, 13, 14-year-old kids out in the streets protesting and defending their rights and their future.
Thank you so much for explaining all of that to us. And to those young people that are in the streets, I hope if some of them are watching, to know that we Canadians are also standing with them and supporting them in their bravery and their courage in fighting for democracy and for their rights. I would like to, if I have time, ask a quick question of Professor Lindstedt. Because, oh good, I do have some time. Because, Professor, you said something. You said that the trajectory of this law is going toward the kinds of things that are done in Russia. And I note that the protesters are referring to this as the Russian law. And I know that often authoritarian regimes will use language of democracy, will mimic and try to draw parallels where there are none in order to try to justify repressive laws and justify the undermining of democracy. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that is done and how it's being played out in Georgia.
How authoritarian regimes mimic democracy? In general, or in...
No, how they use the language of democracy to cloak the fact that what they're doing is actually very undemocratic.
That actually touches upon the last question a little bit. So it's a really good question that they, in addition to mimicking democracy like the institutions, they like to use the language of democracy. And so in some cases, these laws have been copied in the Russian law almost verbatim, like word for word. So it's not clear if Russia is directing countries to do this word for word. They're inspired by, or there's just some collaboration or coinciding interest. But we see that Russia is playing a huge role here, particularly in the countries in the post-Soviet sphere. But using the language of democracy, why do they do this? I mean, we speculate whether or not they're trying to showcase some kind of like legitimacy to their own public and convince them that they're living in a democratic society. And it's just a very common tool used by autocratizing countries to use this specific language of democracy. And we found that surveys in authoritarian regimes, countries that are authoritarian, the people living in them sometimes are led to believe that they do live in a democracy and that the elections are relatively free and fair. And that just shows how strong some of these propaganda campaigns have been. I think in the Georgian case, this is a much more difficult case for the leading the regime, the Georgia Dream Party, to convince the public that what they're doing is for, because of democratic reasons. I think that a lot of the Georgian public is well aware of what's happening and they can't, have the wool pulled over their eyes. But they use this type of lingo.
Can you wrap it out, please? We are out of time, please.
Yeah, they lose this type of lingo. It's often something that they do.
Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, pour 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, you have 7 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today for this very important study. We do stand with you, and most members sitting on this committee have been barred from traveling to Russia, so something perhaps does unite us. There's been a lot of mentions of Russia since this meeting began. Professor Lindstedt, would it be possible to inform the committee, could you show what the links are between the Russian government and the Georgian government, please? So it's not exactly clear what the links are. I can only base it on what the people that I interviewed had said, that they're not entirely clear whether or not the de facto leader, Ivanishvili, has coinciding interests with Russia, as I mentioned, or is being controlled by Russia. And that's something that different people speculated to what extent. But Russia does not see the countries in the post-Soviet sphere as independent in many ways. It doesn't respect their sovereignty. And there is an aggressive propaganda campaign obviously in countries like Ukraine, but also in countries such as Georgia, to try to polarize, to try to provide this idea that the Western values are trying to infiltrate traditional values, the idea that there are Western forces that are destabilizing Georgia. I mean, Russian influence and propaganda, which we sometimes refer to as sharp power because it's sort of perforating and undermining regimes, is extensive to the degree I can go into more detail if needed.
Merci.
Thank you. That brings me to my second question for Ms. Chicheva. Some experts believe that at present, to divert public attention from the bill and to divide the opposition further, LGBTQ issues are being highlighted, same-sex marriage, and according to the party in power, they are protecting family values and traditions. Do you have any information on this? Because I think this is a propaganda issue.
Thank you for the question. As I have mentioned, disinformation, misinformation, and anti-Western propaganda has all come together, and especially for past month, but since the last year's protests. You are correct when you mentioned about the LGBTQI draft law, which is actually draft constitutional change. That at the same time, when Georgian Dream introduced or reintroduced the agents law, it also has been going, and they have been having meetings in the regions and having this discussions with the wider public. So honestly, as there is less than 6 months left before our upcoming parliamentary elections, which is going to be extremely important due to its first fully proportional elections. And as you might be aware, this could actually mean that maybe first time Georgia will have multi-party democracy in place. So therefore, this whole spring has been occupied by the discussions of the Western agents attacking NGOs, potential threats from the West, including LGBTQI community, and the rights of women has also kind of coming up in discussions. As you might be aware, also in the fast track, Parliament has made a change by abolishing gender quotas for the upcoming parliamentary elections, basically with 3-day discussions, while actually getting gender quotas took numbers of years of advocacy and fight for it. So all of this legislation that has been ongoing at the same time while there is the protest, while there is the large discussion about basically abolishing freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. Of course, this is a very warning and very depressing development. But as it was mentioned, I think then people seeing the number of people protesting and coming out and being very loud about importance of our constitution, defending our constitution, which is a very democratic. It is the legislations we have mentioned. We believe that they are anti-constitutional. So even if these laws are going to be adopted, for sure we're going to go and continue fight in a constitutional court, and then continue in Strasbourg and so on. So of course we're not going to get tired for fighting for this rights and fighting for Georgia's European and Euro-Atlantic future.
J'ai une question et ça.
I have a question for both witnesses, if you are able to answer. Does the ruling party's propaganda work on some strata of society? What we're seeing is that people who are demonstrating, who want more freedom, who are fighting for democracy, that is happening, but is what we are hearing from the government, is their propaganda, which is promulgated through a range of means. Does it work on some strata of Georgian society?
I'll just go briefly. I think it does work with a small segment of society, that particularly in a country like Georgia, where there is patron clientelistic style elections, where there's an exchange of favors in some ways at some of these elections. Some of this propaganda does work with a segment of society, but I believe that survey research has shown also that Georgia has a big chunk of a large majority, I think, that really do want democracy. And I'll save more time for Ketavan.
Oh, thank you. I want to say, unfortunately, the propaganda kind of works on certain amounts, of course. That's why I guess propagandists usually use propaganda, because misinformation and disinformation, with all the channels and available sources that the government has, of course it is working, but fortunately it's not on a majority. And that's again when Georgians, with 75 to 80% of Georgians being very strongly supportive of Georgia's EU and NATO integration. And I think it has been extremely important that our Western partners have been very fast. We have shared with you the links of our Western partners' reactions, from State Department to EU to UNDP, all the different international organizations.
Thank you,
as
thank
well
you,
as
madam.
countries.
Thank you. We exceed by 15 minutes.
Merci, merci, merci
Sorry.
beaucoup.
Excusez-moi.
Mr. Green.
Thank you very much. And I would like to begin with Ms. Chachava. My apologies on your name. I'm new to this committee, and I want to offer you the opportunity to provide context. I don't have a deep background in this. I just want to acknowledge that right off the bat. But what would you say to people who might be watching this committee, looking at kind of even just your office set up with an American flag, a NATO flag, a European Union flag, a Ukrainian flag, what would you say to people who might look at that and say, gosh, this isn't really an organization kind of centered and completely focused on Georgia? I want to offer you the opportunity just to respond to that so that we can take that off the table.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And actually, you are saying my last name perfectly. So just to give a short background about Georgia, right? We are in our neighbor Russia is occupying 20% of our country. Georgians have been fighting to survive for many centuries, and the choice of Georgian people to move forward with a democratic, free society has been made when we got independency. So since for last over 35 years, Georgians have been fighting. We have been dying for the freedom. We have been moving forward to become the members of NATO and EU. And every government that has won any election in this country has always been pro-Western and has been very clear that NATO, EU is the future for Georgia. This is where we strive. So when it comes to Center for Development and Democracy, thank you for a question and opportunity to say a few words about us. We have been established in 2008, actually when Russia has occupied additional parts of Georgia, and we were under the war. For us, it is crucial that we bring our country closer to you. One of our main founding principles has been to support awareness raising, to work with people, and we actually work with the religious leaders very closely. We work with the different groups of society. We try to bring dialogue. We try to overcome the polarization that our country is facing. And as you mentioned, yes, we are not hiding. Yes, it's very clear where we stand because this is what the mission and vision of our state has been. This is a constitution of Georgia that in Article 78 says that Georgia is going to become a member of EU and NATO, and that's the mission of our country and every elected official in this country. So, of course, we as a civil society, we fight for freedom. We fight for freedom of expression. We fight for freedom of speech. We fight for human rights. We fight for democracy. We observe elections. We want to ensure the voters have the rights and their rights are secured. So yes, and I myself have been educated. I just graduated from King's College London with the UK funding. I have been lucky to study in the US, and I have been lucky to receive Canadian support as well.
Thank you.
So of course we try to bring our partners here,
Sure.
and we try to work together.
Okay, I mean, from the outside looking in, I'm not on this committee, but I heard your testimony. What I'm trying to reconcile, and this is for all of the people that are witnesses today, is we look at this kind of new response that we have in the West towards TikTok. We talk about foreign interference. We talk about foreign ownership. And so my next question would be to Professor Lindstedt. Recognizing that, how would you help us, because I know that you're an expert in comparative politics, how would you help us kind of unpack what is being proposed in Georgia and this kind of reaction that we're seeing in the West towards entities like TikTok, for instance?
Right. So it's my understanding that some of the issues related to TikTok have to do with concerns about surveillance and so forth. And don't have anything to do really with supporting democracy. And in this case, these NGO laws are about really trying to cut at the heart of groups that are so vital for democracy, transparency, free flowing of information, and that aren't about surveilling the population. It's a really good question, but I think there's really huge differences here because some of the people that are working for these NGOs, it's not foreigners who are working there; they are Georgians who are working there, and they rely on foreign funding to keep them afloat. And they're trying to help promote democratic values in their own country, which are important for any country that is trying to support free elections, civil society, et cetera, all these types of things. So that's where I would see the difference lies.
It's your testimony that and I totally appreciate that. Yeah, I found it very helpful. The TikTok conversation has an element around foreign ownership, but is primarily driven on the platform, its algorithms, its AI, its ability to have kind of backdoor access. Whereas what we're contemplating here is more about active NGOs on the ground that are promoting ideology that might be counter to the government's line. Is that a fair characterization?
Exactly. They're threatening to
I'm going
the
to ask a
incumbent
follow-up.
Georgia Dream Party.
Yeah, let's segue to that. It's a good segue. The Georgian Dream Party has claimed that the Foreign Agents Bill aims to increase transparency in foreign funding, and it says that it draws inspiration from Western laws like the U.S. Foreign Agents Registration Act. You'll note likely that here in Canada, one of the outcomes or one of the recommendations on foreign interference is a kind of a foreign agents registry framework as well. So could you perhaps give us a little understanding about what are the distinctions between Georgia's Foreign Agents Bill and the U.S. FARA Act?
I think in this instance, we're talking about the Georgia Dream Party being threatened by its own people who want democracy, whether it be the opposition, whether it be journalists, whether it be academics, people that work for NGOs, rather than some sort of foreign entity. And that's where, to me, the distinction lies, that it isn't about the free flow of information that is so critical in a democracy. It's about trying to undercut people who are trying to share transparency and information, support civil society.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. I'm sorry to cut you. Time is out. All the members, j'aimerais remercier tous les témoins.
I would like to thank all witnesses for their testimony and for taking part in this study. Thank you all.
Next, please. Mr.
Thank
Lake,
you so much.
just
We will resume the meeting. I would like to welcome our witnesses appearing as individuals. Ms. Magdalena Debenska, Professor of Political Science at the Université de Montréal, appearing by video conference. Mr. Jeff Sahadio, Professor of Political Science at Carleton University. And Nathalie Sabanadze, Principal Fellow for Russian Studies. You will each have a maximum of 5 minutes for your statement, after which we will move to questions. Welcome, Ms. Magdalena Debenska. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for this invitation. So for a subcommittee on international human rights, there are currently 3 interconnected issues in Georgia that should, in my opinion, be monitored. First, the very content of the bill on foreign agents. Then cases of violent repression of peaceful protests. And lastly, the changes announced alongside this bills on LGBTQ issues which target gay propaganda. The Georgian Green government is presenting the draft bill on foreign influence transparency as being similar to the U.S. Foreign Agents Registration Act. The opposition, on the other hand, sees it as being modeled on the Russian legislation, with all the repercussions that may have on freedom of speech and civil society activism in general. Comparing the content of the 3 bills, American, Russian, and the Georgian draft, clearly point to the opposition's interpretation. While the American legislation targets individuals and political organizations controlled and financed mainly by foreign governments considered to be antagonistic, the Georgian bill targets all civil society organizations, media, university institutions, religious or sporting organizations, humanitarian organizations, 20% or more of whose funding comes from foreign sources. All these organizations would have to register as implementer organizations of foreign powers' interests, and the result would be tight control of their activities. In cases where the bill does not specify which foreign power is involved, the government and Georgian Dream members, as well as its ally, the People's Power Party, clearly implies it is targeting Western influence, particularly the EU and the United States. In the wake of tensions surrounding the draft bill, on April 19th, the Georgian parliament slipped under the radar with a number of amendments to tax legislation, facilitating financial exchanges, particularly with Russia, and funds in tax havens. These changes clearly benefit the founder of the ruling party, Bidzina Ivanishvili, a Georgian millionaire who made his wealth in Russia, as well as Russian oligarchs. Why this bill now? Why this bill at all, knowing the mass protests that will follow? In fact, the same bill had been introduced in the spring of 2023 and withdrawn following massive street protests. It's happening again. There is every indication that this is an electoral ploy. Parliamentary elections are scheduled for October, and it might have seemed an opportune moment since Europe and the U.S. are occupied elsewhere. In December, Georgia obtained candidate status for the EU, so the stick is less important. If the ruling power was hoping that protesters would become exhausted because the legislative process is so drawn out, it might backfire because it could serve to enhance the determination of opposition parties and potentially rally the opposition. The aim is to divert public attention and further divide the opposition by bringing other issues to the fore, like LGBTQ+ issues and same-sex marriage. However, despite the overwhelming support for accession to the EU and NATO, this remains a divisive social issue with the potential to win over some undecided voters. The Orthodox Church and social conservatism are well entrenched in Georgia because it is a society where 62 people do not feel or say they do not feel represented by existing political parties, and where perspectives on society differ in urban and rural settings. The Georgian Dream is playing yet another card, the threat of opening a second front in Georgia if neighboring Russia is provoked. The memory of the 2008 Russian-Georgian War is vivid, as is the lack of Western support to push Russia back from the Chikhnavili region of South Ossetia and from Abkhazia. Until now, the government has walked a bit of a tightrope, advocating membership of the EU and NATO and still increasing trade and flights with Russia. It is now clearly drawing closer to Russia to the benefit of the economic interests of some party members. The largely pro-Western society is torn apart by the fear of armed conflict, by societal stakes, and by fear of war. It is also torn by fear of economic and social consequences. In short, the Foreign Agents Bill goes beyond human rights. What's being played out in the streets of Tbilisi at the moment and in the elections slated for October will be the type of political regime that exceeds and the geopolitical orientation of Georgia. My apologies for interrupting you, but you are out of time. Mr. Jeff Sahadjo, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm Jeff Sahadjo, professor of political science at Carleton University. I've lived and worked in Georgia for parts of 3 years now. Have many friends and colleagues involved in the demonstrations. I want to talk first about the motivations behind the bill's introduction. As it's been said before, with elections approaching in a few months, Georgian Dream wants to basically cut off any independent outlets that might either critically examine the run-up to the election, that might offer the alternative parties a voice, or that might actually survey the election, that might offer some kind of independent count. Georgian Dream is determined not to lose this election. I do not think that they will accept a loss in the election. Right now, their support hovers around 25%, which is more than any of the other parties in a proportional representation, but certainly makes them far from comfortable that they will actually legitimately form a majority. They have actually already gone to the trouble of deregistering far-right parties so they can't split the vote, and Georgian Dream has moved to try and occupy that space itself. Another argument for the timing is basically a chaos theory argument that, in fact, Georgian Dream wants demonstrations. They want this opposition. Perhaps they didn't appreciate the extent to which they would get it, to keep the opposition on the defensive. If there are clashes, they can blame youth, they can blame these sort of pro-Western organizations, and exhaust the opposition also before the elections. There's this question of state capture, the ruling party controlling more and more of the economy and society, and this has already been discussed. And, again, to follow up on Professor Dominska, this law allows them to go after everybody, and they've been very open about that. They've argued that there are 26,000 NGOs in Georgia, a country of 4 million people. To count that, they have to count basically every independent organization that's not part of the government. And these are very heavy fines. These include media organizations and the like. So they want to foster this narrative of decadent young people who do not profess to follow the language, fatherland, and faith triad that Georgian Dream is actively pursuing. In terms of the reemergence of Bidzina Ivanishvili, who's come out of the shadows now, just as a background, his fortune of about $5 billion is equivalent to 1/3 of the entire GDP of the country. And it's 10 times more than any other oligarch has in any other country. He's largely wielded power behind the scenes. So for him to come out and give a speech last week where he attacked the global party of war, ironically, he did not mean Russia, which occupies 20% of Georgia and, of course, has invaded Ukraine, attacked internal enemies. It's a clear turn towards the language of Viktor Orban in Hungary. You've seen now Robert Fico in Slovakia use this language. Irakli Kobakidze, who's the prime minister of Georgian Dream, was at CPAC in Budapest, and it's already been discussed, relying heavily on this anti-LGBTQ program. And in fact, I was talking to a colleague of mine who just went home for Easter, conversations with her older relatives in the village saying that some of these people are now, who believe this Georgian Dream propaganda, are now actually starting to associate Europe with LGBTQ rights. And this is exactly the Georgian Dream scenario. So pro-European is now trying to mean different things, and that's how Georgian Dream is trying to manipulate the society with propaganda. But there's a vulnerability to it. There is a very conservative portion of society in Georgia. Ivanishvili, again, has not been attacking Russia. Money laundering from Russia to Georgia has increased significantly since the war. Georgian Dream has restored flights between Tbilisi and Moscow, which had been canceled. So we are at a tipping point. So just to conclude, this law is at the tip of an iceberg. What's motivating a lot of the protests is the mobility issue to Europe, which
half a minute, please.
Before. There's about 1 million country of 4 million, potentially about 1 million Georgians who are working illegally now in the European Union, and of course many working legally too. And this need to escape to Europe, and this is the card that the European Union can play. The need for young Georgians to work in Europe in a society that's increasingly impoverished. The Georgian Dream does not want to talk about the socioeconomic issues. They want to talk about foreign agents. They want to talk about LGBTQ. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Perfectly, 5 minutes. And now I would like to invite Madame Natalie Sabanadze. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please. Muted, Madam.
Thank you very much. It is a great honor to address you on this topic, which is very important for Georgia. I would like to start by describing this law as a perfect case of weaponization of transparency. Under the pretext of transparency and openness, it definitely aims at silencing and delegitimizing civil society, undermining independent media, and simply suppressing dissent and freedom of expression and thought. Georgia has a vibrant civil society, and this is entirely thanks to the foreign, namely Western support. Georgia's partners have invested in democracy promotion since Georgia regained independence in the early 90s, and that is exactly what resulted in Georgia being a free country, despite not being a perfect consolidated democracy. In the official narrative justifying the law, it is being compared to similar American, British, French, and other legislation. FARA, the American act, is most frequently invoked, and incidentally, this was also most frequently invoked by Putin when he introduced foreign agents law. These acts aim at unfriendly countries and organizations that lobby on their behalf. Georgian law aims at friends who helped out through difficult years of transition and invested in making Georgia more democratic and, in fact, more transparent. If FARA and similar acts target enemies, Georgian law targets friends, namely its Western supporters, with whom we want to be institutionally linked through the membership in the European Union and NATO. According to this draft, we've heard that many times, every organization that receives more than 20% of foreign funding will have to declare itself as agent of foreign influence. This will cover not only media and civil society organizations, but also academic institutions and research centers. There is no significant local funding for this, and even if there was, I think you can imagine that the selection criteria would be very strict, a total loyalty to the ruling party. Both in its letter and in spirit, this bill bears a close resemblance to the foreign agents law passed in Russia. This is why protesters in Tbilisi call it the Russian law. And we have seen how this law has destroyed civil society in Russia. Furthermore, Russia has been amending this law and making it even more draconian, expanding its scope of application from organizations to individuals. People are encouraged to spy on each other and denounce their acquaintances and neighbors as potential foreign agents or suspects to be foreign agents. The ease with which labels such as traitors and enemies of the people are applied is eerie, especially in the country that lived through the horrors of Stalinism. political motives that underpin both the Russian and Georgian laws are the same. These are prevention of the so-called colored revolutions, suppression of critical voices, eradication of Western influence, especially Western democracy promotion measures, and destruction of an open, pluralistic society. In the case of Georgia, there is an additional and very important factor at
One more
play,
minute,
and
please.
this is Georgia's. Thank you. And this is Georgia's European integration. The adoption of this law will be a serious obstacle to the opening of accession negotiations. When a similar law was adopted in Hungary, the European Court of Justice struck it down, deeming it incompatible with European law and values. Official statements from high-level EU representatives all warned the Georgian government against the adoption of this law and call on the authorities not to jeopardize Georgia's prospects for European integration. And thousands of people who are standing in the streets of Tbilisi are fighting for their future. They see clearly the choice. One is turning Georgia into a Russia-style autocracy, and another is becoming a European democracy. And the majority of them have made their choice, except that it has to be defended now. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we open the floor for debate. We start with Mr. Majmendal. You have the floor for 4 minutes, please.
I'll start the question with Ambassador Sabanidze. Thank you for that presentation. You were the voice of Georgia to the European Union. Do you believe Europe has the strength today to confront Russian interference in Georgia?
That's a very good question, and I think that's something that the European officials are really struggling. What is happening in Georgia is a surprise for Brussels. In fact, it's a surprise to many people, myself included, because you are right. I was representing Georgia in Brussels for 8 years, and I was doing it under this government. I resigned 3 years ago when I saw that the direction was changing dramatically. Georgia, for many in the EU, could have been taken for granted because Georgia was so determined to join European Union, to join the NATO, and it was ready and did bear costs for it. 2008 war is just one example. So the kind of shift is really extraordinary. It is a dramatic departure of Georgia's foreign policy trajectory that it has been pursuing since the restoration of independence.
Thank you.
And this pivot, and for the EU, how to deal with it, on the one hand, it has candidate status, it has accession negotiations. It tries now to negotiate, to put pressure on the government and say, if you pass this law, you will not move on to another stage. I think this is the only thing they can. But the Georgian government propaganda can use this against the EU and say, you see, they're the ones who don't want us. So it puts them in a very difficult position.
Thank you very much. Let me ask a follow-up question because I think we heard Professor Sahadeo describe how Ivanishvili might react under a variety of scenarios. Assuming that the protesters become increasingly agitated into the summer and create a kind of instability, how do you think Ivanishvili's government would react to them? Would they cross into the Rubicon into being violent?
I don't know. This is very difficult to predict. What I know is that we are watching almost like the same film go over and over again. This is not the first time that has happened in Georgia. In fact, in Georgia, the rule is to change the government through street protests rather than through ballot box. Last time with Rose Revolution, Shevardnadze conceded. Saakashvili conceded too, even though it was a parliamentary kind of loss of power, but the situation was pretty much pre-revolutionary. And this time, we are very close to this kind of political crisis. And I'm not so sure that this government will concede quite so easily. So I think this is a dangerous moment in Georgia. You've heard that this is the second time that they've brought this law. backing down second time is politically more costly than it was for the first time. And the protesters are also determined to fight until the very end. So whoever is going to give up first, and whether this will become violent is really difficult to foresee. But that is not the plan of the protesters. I think people will try to do everything to avoid it, but it can also be provoked. And we have seen cases where they send some provocateurs beating up people, etc. So every scenario is possible.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Majmender. Madame Damov, you have the floor for 4 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair. Ms. Pembinska, you, in your opening remarks, mentioned gay propaganda, and we're talking about LGBTQ2 rights, and you did as well, Mr. Sahadio. I'm just wondering, can you elaborate a little bit how this law is tied to those rights, and also you mentioned same-sex marriage?
Yes, thank you for the question. I will clarify. So it is not. It's two different laws. Yes. So the law on the project of the law on foreign agents is something that is on the table now, but was also on the table last year. And all the issues concerning legislation on LGBTQ+ are also on the political agenda for some time. However, what some experts and myself we can observe is that this the timing of putting right now this proposals about changing the legislation about the issues of LGBTQ and same-sex marriages is serving the Georgian dream to try to divide the opposition and the society. There's a huge protests against the law of foreign agents, and there is probably, maybe it was a miscalculus from the Georgian dream to put it on the agenda, but the laws about the LGBTQ plus the putting it on the table right now serves to try to divide the opposition, because within the society this is something that some portion of the society, Georgian society, is receptive to, because of the conservative values, because of the Georgian Orthodox Church and its importance in the Georgian society. So this is something, in framing it, as it was mentioned, framing it as European values and Europeanization that comes with these laws and LGBTQ plus, etc., is a propaganda and is serving the purpose of dividing the opposition.
Thank you very much. I don't have much time left, but I'm going to pass it over to my colleague.
Thank you. I just also wanted to join my colleagues in saluting the courage and the convictions of Georgians who've been on the streets over the course of the past month. If I could just ask Professor Sahadio, thank you for being back. Very grateful. That was a very insightful opening remark. Was wondering if, in your opinion, the Georgia Dream Party is still interested in joining the EU, because that's enshrined in their constitution, but I'm somewhat puzzled as to whether they're still interested or not.
In 40 seconds, please.
I think the question is no. The answer is no, and I think this is why Ivanishvili came out with that speech last week, is to make that pivot. Official line is now, we'll join by 2030, when we can be sure that the EU will allow us to keep our own sovereignty. And to this argument that we need the EU and the EU has these potential cudgels against us, he says, we have a friend in Hungary. So he'll block anything that the EU can do to us. Better to stay out now. We'll wait for more Orbáns, more Ficos, more Maronis in Italy, and then perhaps we'll join. But I think the answer to that is no. And
thank you, Professor. Thank you. Monsieur Brunet du Seb, vous avez le...
Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, the floor is yours. Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today for this very important study. Ms. Dubinska, we know that the Georgian draft bill stipulates that all media organizations, NGOs in Georgia must register and will be portrayed as organizations defending foreign interests. Do we have an idea of the number of media organizations this might affect in Georgia? The exact number I won't tell you, but there are independent media and civil society that, like NGOs and like civil society, are and do, I should say, benefit from tremendous support from Western countries. So there are many numbers of independent media organizations. I don't know the exact number. Perhaps the ambassador might have an answer to that. But really, the survival of independent media in Georgia hinges on this. A question for the ambassador. In the last round of questioning, we talked about the Orthodox Church, and it aroused my curiosity. To what extent is the clergy working hand in hand with the government, or isn't it?
Officially and constitutionally, of course, clear separation. But traditionally, Orthodox Church has played a very important role. In general, Orthodox churches, because it's a national Georgian Orthodox Church, there is a tradition of identifying the role of the church and Christianity with the kind of self-identification in Georgia because of the region where it is located. It's just Georgians and Armenians that are Christian nations and so on. In this particular case, and lately, the church has become very closely linked to the government ruling party. It also has traditionally had strong ties with Russian Orthodox Church, even though Georgian Church is independent, but the ties are very strong. And it's definitely a conservative force. It has an influence. The patriarch is considered to be as a person that many people respect very much, one of the highest respected personalities in Georgia. So the position the church takes vis-a-vis certain issue is quite important. And normally they are very conservative. They were against anti-discrimination law, for instance, that Georgia had to pass in order to get visa liberalization with the EU. They're certainly against LGBTQ plus rights. And in this case, they have been relatively balanced, but still supportive of the governmental position.
Il me reste un petit peu de temps, je pense. Une dernière question, parce que Madame...
I do have a bit of time left. Ms. Dubinska, you gave us 3 points that we should be looking at: the content of the law, repression of protests, and the LGBTQ plus legislation. These are all linked, and the consequences, protests and the repression of those protests. But what the committee should understand is that the government is trying to divert attention with legislation attacking the LGBTQ community so that it can get its foreign agents bill through. Have people understood this? It's not so much to slip the foreign agents legislation through. They seem to have sufficient support to do that. It's more to divide the opposition, which is fragmented. It's a very divided opposition. And so protests and the violence we're seeing in the streets of Tbilisi could rally. So they don't want that to happen. So by diverting attention and introducing the LGBTQ plus legislation, an attempt is being made to thwart a rallying of the opposition.
4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to begin with Professor Sahedio. What levers, if any, does Canada have to influence the outcomes or provide kind of international pressure on the Dream Party and the ruling party in Georgia?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the first thing we can do, when we heard in the previous speaker's statement, is to show our support for the protesters in Georgia, to make it clear that we do not tolerate violent actions by the security services. And I know we don't have an embassy on the ground there, but we can observe very carefully and we can condemn. The key actors here, I think, are the security services, how much violence would they be willing to use if Georgian Dream orders them to? Because traditionally, that's the way governments have fallen. It's the security services decide enough is enough of attacking our own people. So I think if we can keep the focus on the demonstrators' support for them and awareness and condemnation of the security services, make it clearer to people, leaders of security services, Western countries are watching them. Also, the other key element in this is the individual members of the Georgian Dream Party. So not the leadership. Ivanishvili, I think one of the reasons he came out with that speech is to harden some of these Georgian Dream members who are not so excited about this law, especially after it's had these massive protests, and would be willing to shift the law. Now, what's going to happen is the law likely is going to be adopted. The president can then veto this law. It's ceremonial. The president will veto it, send it back with modification suggestions. This is a time when we can start to approach Georgian Dream members and talk to them about the way that this law might be modified to make it more like a Western style. They can keep their law if they want, but take off the edges of it. And I think we could do that, and that would allow elections to be held fairly. So I think there is a role for Canada to play.
I'll put the same question to Professor Dybinska. If you distinctly, please.
The same question. I think this is our role in Canada is rather limited. I would repeat the same thing that Professor Sahedio said, but I think that it's Europe. Europe has much more carrots and sticks right now than Canada may have. Although, because we are in NATO, we could play that card. I think the importance is indeed to put pressure, to show our commitment to democracy in Georgia, etc. But it is much more about internal affairs than about external affairs, I think.
Ambassador, do you have any reflections on ways in which we might be able to pull levers to help support people on the ground, the popular movements that are calling for better democracy there?
I agree with the point about the need to protect protesters. I think they're really the vulnerable ones, and consistent and incremental international pressure does work. The Georgian Dream is not as susceptible as some other governments were in Georgia, but it still is important and people hear it. So I think that should be maintained. I also agree with Professor Dybinska that NATO is an area to look for Canada. But in addition to that, I think it's very important to send a clear message to those who are destroying democracy in Georgia that there will be some consequences, and that should be coordinated. I think it's one thing for individual countries to do it, but another to do it in a coordinated manner. And Canada, US, Georgia's close partners who have supported Georgia for years, and I have seen Canadian funding for many years of extremely important projects. I think these ambassadors on the ground or delegations from the capitals should send a unanimous message of what will be the consequences of this. Of course,
thank you, Ambassador.
The Georgian people will cover.
Thank you, Ambassador. Maintenant, je tiens à remercier les témoins.
I would like to thank witnesses for their testimony and for taking part in our study.
It's highly appreciated. pour les membres du comité.
For committee members, would you be willing to go into in camera for a few moments?
Because we will lose a couple of minutes.
Do you mind rather if we don't go?
OK. Donc, le comité va maintenant procéder à l'examen des questions.
The committee will now examine a number of questions relating to its upcoming work, the current human rights situation in Iran. The deadline for proposing witnesses for the study is May 8th, 5 p.m. Regarding a budget of $7,500 for the study of Georgia's draft bill on foreign agents, the budget has been distributed to all committee members. Is it the pleasure of the Commission to adopt the budget? Carried. We will now go to the motion of Mr. Majumdar. The subcommittee is returning to the motion by Mr. Majumdar, which was distributed to everybody on Wednesday. Please go ahead. Mr. Majumdar.
No.
The floor is yours.
I wasn't aware we were doing committee business, but if we are, I think that we should do it in camera, as we always do.
But they're saying they don't have time.
Because I asked you before.
I thought we were just doing the budget. I didn't think we were going to be actually discussing
So
studies.
you prefer to go to camera?
Absolutely, or the next meeting?
Mr. I believe the time we will be out of time. What do you think, Mr.?
We had agreed that we would discuss this item today, but we don't have time to go in camera, so we can push it to the next meeting in good faith, knowing that you've had a week to kind of consider this motion. I just want to make sure we get due consideration.
Okay. So we'll... Yes.
If I could just clarify two things, Mr. Chair. Yes. First of all, would the members be willing to do a short statement on everything that we heard for the committee to release? If we could ask the analysts to draft something that would be subject to your approval. And secondly, you did mention Sudan, and just wanted to confirm that all the members are in favor of slotting that in for a few weeks from now. Thanks.
Yes, Mr. Lake.
I just think Anita had said that we should discuss committee business in camera, and those are both committee business items. And so if we're going to be consistent, we've moved on from one agenda item to a different agenda item, and we ought to...
Pam, please. Thank you.
Sorry. I think in fairness, when we have witnesses and committee that gets delayed by votes, we could get members to sub in for us so that we don't have to cut our meetings short, Chair. I think we had resources to 6 o'clock. And normally we get a full 2 hours after votes. So I think, maybe we can all try to get subs if we're not able to stay for the full 2 hours. I just think it would be fair to the study and to the witnesses that we get.
Thank you, Ms. Damov. Mr. Lake.
That's actually not the case. Traditionally, committees that are due to end at 5:30 end at 5:30 by default. I don't know where this new, idea comes from. We all have calendars. We can agree by unanimous consent to extend, but it's not by default that it just goes 2 hours. If the government decides to have votes, we have votes, and committee time ends at 5:30. And I have 20 constituents that I'm having dinner with at 5:30, and I'm going to be late, and I need to be there. But that's not my fault. So the committee time is 5:30. It's 5:30 right now.
Okay.
In that case, I move to adjourn. And
okay.
Sorry. I thought.
Ali, you want to?
Sorry.
Yeah. Pam, you want to talk also?
No, I just, every other committee that I'm on, that is what we're told by the chair, is that we get 2 hours of committee time. So this is, I have not heard from any other committee where we get a hard and fast rule. So maybe for the next meeting, Chair, you could just clarify that for us so that we know moving forward.
Clerk to comment on this. I believe she will come back with the right answer. Okay.
I wanted to say no one's suggesting that Mr. Lake should be denied the opportunity to meet with 20 of his constituents. We would like him to do so. It's just that if this is going to happen, we can have substitutes, just like we do on any other occasion. Thank you.
Mr. Lake.
On that note, we don't. You should have stopped.
Excuse me.
We don't know when we don't know when we're going to have votes. I mean, I didn't know we had 2 votes until we were already having the votes. So I couldn't arrange for a sub because I didn't know we were having 2 votes today. And that happens in the House of Commons more often than not right now in a minority parliament. But I move we adjourn.
Everything agreed? Okay, thank you. Meeting is adjourned.